I think this is working all right. Remember that we've been taking cycle 1 of the Sundays of Lent, and last Sunday it was about the Samaritan woman at the well. So, words I want to begin with, but the hour will come. In fact, it is here already when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. We are told in words that Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well, and he said that we must worship in spirit and truth. The Samaritans worshipped at Mount Gerizim, and of course the Jews in Jerusalem. But Jesus said we must worship in spirit and in truth. Now, what exactly does that mean, to worship in spirit and in truth? I hope to uncover a bit of that today to make us realize what it is to worship in spirit and in truth. But I think to understand these words, we must go back to the Hebrew prophets. The prophetic movement in Israel began about 750 BC, and it was the first attempts made on the part of the prophets to worship in spirit and in truth. Early worship in ancient Israel was really animal sacrifices. The worship was expressed in animal sacrifices. The sacrifice was an offering representing ourselves, our due to God. But as so often happens, the externals of the rite became all important and the most important aspect of it. It is because in the eyes of the people, a peace offering was made after a passage of time. It was a kind of peace offering. Now, the externals, as I said, in worship took over. What they represent, our own self-offering, was in fact forgotten. So it was through the prophets that we are reminded what true worship is. That ancient Israel's reminded that true worship must be accompanied by an internal action of the heart and mind. Not just an external one, but an internal action of the heart and mind. We hear God through the prophets rail against these purely empty sacrifices. Thus, the prophet Amos, for example, proclaims, "I hate and despise your feasts. I take no pleasure in your solemn festivals. I regret your oblations." But then, we're told later in the same passage, "But let justice flow like a water, and integrity like an unfailing stream." You see, it was worship and action. Well, that's very important. Worship and action. Worship and life. See, they are integrated. Very often we try to separate them, but they're integrated. The link is also present, this lack of link rather, is present in our present age. And it has been for centuries. We often like to compartmentalize our lives. seems to be, or we think it seems to be, easier. It seems to be more logical and more sensible. So therefore, I have my work life, my entertainment, my relaxation, my financial life, and my love life, all in separate little compartments. You see, in this sense, I might see my worship as unrelated to areas in the whole cycle of life, but it's all related. So are we getting perhaps a little bit closer to understanding what we mean to worship in spirit and in truth? You know, we can, as I say, take life as a series of unrelated incidents, rather than we could take life as a flowing stream, a living stream, a flow, an offering to God. Two ways of looking at life there. So many of our problems are actually caused, if we analyze it, by compartmentalizing our lives. And I'll take a few examples. Politics likes to stand on its own, can do what it likes. It likes to separate itself, in many cases, from moral and ethical considerations. And it can't do that, but it tries. Business can be seen as profit and growth and not linked to our responsibility for justice. You see the idea of compartmentalizing. Faith can be seen as private, not linked to social obligations. It's interesting that politicians over the years have tried to say religion is just a private affair because it doesn't impact on what they're supposed to be doing. Human growth, take another example, an expansion, is sometimes not linked to the preservation and nurturing of God's sacred environment. It's very evident today that we're well aware of that. Now, the search for meaning and purpose in life is often directed to the self rather than in communion with the author of life and others made in his image. I remember some years ago, I have a lot of friends who necessarily don't share our faith. And one evening, one of them said, our living of life is all about the flourishing of the individual. I said, I agree with that, but I will not accept it unless I add the flourishing of individuals living in communion with God and others. Then I'll accept what you say. Not just the individual alone, but living in communion with God and others. You see, so much of contemporary thought divides rather than unite. Do you see that? We're very, very aware at the moment of tremendous divisions in the world. President Biden sees it as his job now to unite. He makes that his policy. You see, politics is not a separate compartment of life. It involves how we relate to God and the world through the proper ordering of the very components of our life. Business and commerce is not a separate component of life, but an expression of our deeper values. Very often we like to limit things because we don't see how they are interrelated. You might be interested to know that there's a new course, I think it started in Britain somewhere, which is called, you might have heard of it, it's about commerce, but it's called a PPE course. Have you heard of that, PPE? Well, what it basically means is that economics must not be studied on its own, but it has to relate to philosophy, how we think, and politics, how we order our society. So we study commerce now, not in all cases, but when they're doing PPE, by linking it to how we think and how we order society. I think that's an advance forward. That's really an advance forward. Commerce is not seen as a subject on its own, but it's related to how we think and how we relate to others. So it's a good example of a more holistic way of thinking. I have been advocating this as essential to the Christian faith for a long time. Don't compartmentalize, live in a living stream under God. I want to turn now to St. Augustine to further this thought. Augustine saw life as a process of healing, of getting whole. That's how he seemed to see it. We're all in a process of healing, of getting whole. That makes an awful lot of sense to me, because he saw us as not perfect, but perfectible. That we weren't to live in endless cycles, but rather in a growth process. That's how he saw it. Putting aside the negatives in this growth process was putting sin aside, repeating and put sin aside and rather be reborn in God's grace. You see, if you look at it another way, sin, we get involved with sins. We think about sins a lot. But perhaps we should also think about sin. Sin is about selfishness at root, and it causes disharmony, disunity, fragmentation, and rather, now grace, God's life, causes harmony, unity, and integration. You see the difference. It causes harmony, unity, and integration. I want to give an example of disharmony as the seedbed of sin. If you read St. Augustine's Confessions, he's writing about his life as a small boy, and he was stealing peaches with his friends. He makes the point, they didn't need the peaches, rather it was the sheer pleasure of doing wrong. That's what really got Augustine, the sheer pleasure of doing wrong. And these actions worried him very much, because that sheer pleasure in doing wrong would cause disharmony. I can also relate something from my early life. At the age of 5, I always remember this, I was asked by a boy, a friend of mine, to play with him in that afternoon. I said yes. But then another little boy came along and asked me to play. And I realized that this boy had better and more interesting toys. And so I changed my mind. My mother found out and forbade it. She said, "You have to be true to your word. You're selfish. You have forgotten the other boy." You might think that these are trivial incidents, but they reveal a developing self-centeredness. And this, of course, had to be checked. Augustine didn't need the preachers. He had plenty. He wanted to do wrong for pure delight, pure self-satisfaction. It wasn't just ordinary naughtiness. He purposely chose the wrong path. In my less important case, I put my pleasure first, at the risk of hurting a potential friend. So, what does it mean to live in spirit and in truth? Well, it means to live in wholeness. You know, I don't know whether you realize this, but holiness comes from wholeness. And that's a very, very important thing, that everything in your life is not compartmentalized, but put under God and in His service. That's what holiness is. To live in love and truth. Said, to live in truth, spirit and truth. That means to live in love and truth. That's the goal of correct living. It's not to be, very often we're at war with ourselves. We let our actions take over and we don't see where God is and where the good is. I want to conclude with these words. But anyone who drinks, this is from the Gospel from last week, but anyone who drinks the water that I shall give will never be thirsty again. The water that I shall give will turn into a spring inside him, welling up to eternal life.